It always starts small. Just little annoyances, the kind of things you tell yourself to brush off. A trash can tipped over once, maybe twice, and you chalk it up to the wind or some careless kid biking through the neighborhood. But when it happens every single week, always on trash day, always the same way, you start to notice a pattern. And when the pattern leads directly to the shiny chrome grille of your neighbor's Escalade, well, that's when things get interesting. The first time it happened, I thought nothing of it. Trash scattered across the street, a few bags torn open by crows, and me muttering under my breath while picking up after what I assumed was just bad luck. But then it happened again, and again. By the third time, I started watching. I adjusted my morning routine, sipping my coffee at the front window instead of the back porch, keeping an eye on the curb. That's when I caught her. There she was, Karen Wellington, Queen of the Homeowners Association, President of the Board, self-declared enforcer of neighborhood standards. She rolled her SUV out of her driveway, turned the wheel just slightly too far, and with the smug precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, clipped my trash can. It toppled like a toy soldier under her massive front bumper, bags splitting open across the asphalt. She didn't flinch, didn't slow down, just drove on like it was nothing. I wanted to believe it was an accident. But then came the fourth week, the fifth. By the sixth, I had lost count. I started keeping a tally in a notebook. 1 strike, 2 strikes, 10 strikes, 23, 57. 57 times she had knocked my can over, sometimes so hard that the lid snapped off, sometimes dragging it a few feet down the street. Each time I cleaned up the mess. Each time she drove off untouched. The neighborhood wasn't blind. People saw her do it. Some even men mentioned it to me in passing. A quick, "Hey, I think Karen might be hitting your trash can," said with that nervous laugh people use when they don't want to get involved. No one wanted to cross her. After all, she wasn't just any neighbor. She was the HOA president. She held the power to fine, to threaten, to bully anyone into silence. I could have filed a complaint. I could have taken photos and sent them to the board. But the board was Karen. She was judge, jury, and executioner in our community. Complaining to her about herself would have been a joke. So I did what most people do when they're backed into a corner. I waited, I planned, and I made sure she had no idea what was coming. It wasn't just about the trash can anymore. It was about the principle. The more she hit it, the more I realized this wasn't an accident. This was her way of sending a message, a quiet, unspoken form of harassment. She wanted me to move the can, to tuck it behind the house, to follow her rules, even though the city ordinance allowed curbside placement. She wanted control, and she thought I would fold. But I didn't fold. I built. The idea came to me after one particularly nasty morning cleanup, when I found half my garbage strewn across the road and Karen smirking from her porch as if it were some neighborhood entertainment. If she wanted to play games, I would give her one. I spent the weekend in my garage, poring over designs, sketching out measurements, and ordering materials she wouldn't think twice about until it was too late. The plan was simple, but brutal. Replace my flimsy plastic can with something that couldn't be knocked over, something immovable, something that would turn her weekly joyride into her personal downfall, a reinforced trash can. I sourced concrete, rebar, and a steel frame. It looked like an ordinary trash can from the outside, but inside it was a fortress. Heavy, dense and anchored into a hidden foundation just below the curb. I disguised it perfectly, painting it the same dull green as every other can on the block. To anyone passing by, it looked normal. To Karen, it looked like her usual target. But the next time she lined up her Escalade for that smug little clip, she wasn't going to be hitting plastic. She was going to be hitting reinforced concrete. I'll never forget the morning it happened. The roar of her engine, the confident turn of her wheel, the smirk plastered on her face as she lined up for another strike. Then the sound, metal meeting immovable stone, a gut-wrenching crunch that echoed down the street. The front of her SUV crumpled like a soda can, the bumper splitting, the grille shattering, her headlights exploding into shards. The trash can didn't budge. Not an inch. It stood tall, undefeated, while her Escalade smoked in the aftermath. Neighbors came out of their homes at the sound, drawn to the scene like moths to a flame. Whispers filled the air. Phones recorded. Karen, red-faced and stunned, stood beside her wrecked car, trying to play it off, trying to spin the story before it spiraled out of control. But it was too late. The evidence was everywhere, on her SUV, on the pavement, and in the dozens of eyes watching her downfall. What I didn't know then was that this single moment, this crash, was only the beginning. Because hidden beneath the surface of her anger, her embarrassment, and her desperate attempts to regain control, there was a far darker secret waiting to come out, one that would shake the entire neighborhood, destroy her carefully crafted image, and end in a courtroom with me walking away $12,000 richer. But that's getting ahead of the story. For now, the trash can war had finally turned. And Karen Wellington had no idea that her reign over the neighborhood was about to collapse, one shattered Escalade at a time. The morning of the crash rippled through the neighborhood like thunder after our lightning. Everyone had heard it, everyone had seen it. And by noon, the incident had become the only topic of conversation in Lakeside Estates. Karen's Escalade sat mangled on the curb, hood popped up like a broken jaw, fluids leaking across the pavement. For years, she had been the untouchable queen of the community, but now she stood exposed, angry, embarrassed, and desperate. At first, she tried to downplay it. She told anyone who asked that she had miscalculated a turn, brushing it off like it was a small fender bender, but no one bought it. 57 weeks of suspiciously tipped trash cans had not gone unnoticed, even if no one had dared to challenge her before. Now, with her SUV in pieces, and the ordinary trash can standing tall like a monument to defiance, the story practically told itself. I kept quiet. I didn't need to gloat. The can did the talking for me. But while neighbors whispered and chuckled behind closed doors, Karen's anger boiled over in silence. I could see it in her movements, tight, jerky, frantic. She wanted control back, and she wanted revenge. The first thing she did was storm into an emergency HOA meeting. Within 24 hours of the crash, notices went out to all residents. A special session of the board would be held to address a new safety violation. The timing wasn't just suspicious, it was laughable. That evening, I sat in the back of the clubhouse as Karen, her arm in a brace from the airbag impact, sat at the head of the long oak table. She called the meeting to order with her usual sharp tone, trying to project authority, though her swollen lip and black eye from the crash undermined every word she spoke. She announced that certain residents were creating hazards by modifying city-issued trash cans without approval. She claimed that these alterations created a dangerous obstruction to vehicles and pedestrians, and she demanded immediate fines and compliance. Everyone in the room knew she was talking about me. But here's the problem with Karen's plan. The city owned those cans. The HOA had no jurisdiction over their structure or placement as long as they were set out on collection day in the proper spot. And mine was. Perfectly. The board members, most of whom had lived under Karen's thumb for years, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one wanted to side with her, but no one wanted to openly challenge her either. She left the meeting angrier than she had arrived, slamming her binder shut and stomping out to the parking lot, her wrecked Escalade now replaced with a borrowed minivan. I watched her drive away, a small smirk tugging at my lips. She wasn't winning this one, not here. But I knew Karen too well to think she would stop. The escalation was slow, deliberate, and strangely desperate. She began showing up at my curb on trash days, measuring tape in hand, snapping photos as though documenting evidence. She filed noise complaints about imaginary parties. She accused me of unapproved landscaping when I trimmed my hedges. Each complaint was dismissed, but each one made it clear. Karen was unraveling. The real crack in her armor, though, came not from her attacks on me, but from her need to protect her image. Repairing the Escalade wasn't cheap. The estimate floated around the neighborhood. Nearly $14,000 in damage, not counting the rental fees for her temporary vehicle. For someone who flaunted wealth the way Karen did, it seemed odd that she wasn't just cutting a check to fix it immediately. Weeks went by, and the Escalade still sat in her driveway, covered with a tarp. That's when people started asking questions. The whispers began with finances. Didn't Karen just get a new deck built? Didn't she approve the HOA budget for renovations? Didn't our dues go up this year? Small suspicions turned into larger ones, and when one of the quieter board members, a retired accountant, named Mr. Greeley, took it upon himself to look deeper, the first threads of Karen's carefully woven web began to unravel. It started with invoices, payments made to companies that didn't exist, renovations that never happened, services billed but never performed. Greeley quietly passed copies of what he found to a few trusted neighbors, and soon the rumors hardened into something more dangerous. Evidence. Karen, meanwhile, was doubling down on her crusade against me. She cornered me in the street one morning, waving a stack of violation notices she had written herself, threatening fines, liens, even legal action. Her face was twisted with fury, her voice shrill enough to draw curtains back from living room windows all along the street. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The louder she got, the weaker she looked. And the more attention she drew to herself, the more people remembered her wrecked SUV, her bogus meeting, her strange obsession with one man's trash can. Behind the scenes, Greeley and a handful of others quietly organized. They requested a financial audit of the HOA, citing transparency and accountability. Karen fought it tooth and nail, claiming it was unnecessary, but the harder she resisted, the more suspicious she seemed. By the time the motion passed, the tide had turned. She was no longer the queen of the neighborhood, she was the defendant in an investigation she couldn't control. The audit revealed what no one had dared to say aloud. Karen had been embezzling HOA funds. Not just a little. Nearly $47,000 siphoned off over 3 years, tucked away into maintenance projects that never happened, vendor payments made to shell companies she had created. It was meticulous, calculated, and bold. And now it was all unraveling. When the board confronted her with the findings, she tried to spin it, to claim it was a misunderstanding, a bookkeeping error, just a clerical mistake. But the numbers didn't lie. The receipts didn't lie. And when Greeley presented the evidence at the next community meeting, the room erupted. The very neighbors she had bullied and intimidated for years now turned on her with a fury she had never experienced. I sat in the back row, silent, watching the empire of the HOA queen crumble before my eyes. She glared at me once, her face a mask of hatred, as if I had orchestrated it all. But the truth was simpler, and far more satisfying. She had destroyed herself. All I had done was build a trash can she couldn't move. By the end of that night, Karen was stripped of her title, forced to step down as president. The HOA voted unanimously for legal action, and whispers of police involvement circulated. Her once pristine reputation was gone, replaced by the image of a woman caught in her own greed and arrogance. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She might have lost her SUV, her power, and her secrecy, but she still had venom left. And as she stumbled into the shadows of disgrace, she was already plotting her next move. When the financial audit results hit, it was like a grenade going off in the center of the neighborhood. People who had tiptoed around Karen for years suddenly found their voices. Homeowners who had been fined for minor landscaping infractions, who had received threatening letters about mailbox colors or holiday decorations, now realized that the woman enforcing community standards had been quietly bleeding their dues dry. The atmosphere shifted almost overnight. Where once Karen's presence inspired fear, now it provoked outrage. Neighbors stopped lowering their voices when speaking about her. They spoke openly, at HOA meetings, on community forums, even at block parties, about how much money she had stolen, how she had manipulated rules for her own benefit, and how she had targeted anyone who dared to push back. Still, for all the evidence stacked against her, Karen didn't back down. She refused to admit guilt, refused to resign quietly, and instead tried to weaponize the very system she had corrupted. And the first target on her list was me. She claimed the reinforced trash can had been a malicious trap. She filed a lawsuit against me, alleging that I had intentionally created a dangerous obstruction that caused thousands of dollars in damage to her SUV. She said it was sabotage, vandalism, even personal harassment. Her lawyer, a slick man in a tailored suit, painted me as an unhinged neighbor with a vendetta. But here's the thing about lies. They fall apart under scrutiny. And Karen's entire case hinged on the idea that I had modified city property. The truth was, I hadn't. I had requested a replacement can after the old one mysteriously cracked under repeated abuse, and when the new one arrived, I built the reinforced core inside it. The exterior was city-issued, regulation-approved. The foundation it rested on was on my property line, not the city's. Every detail was precise, deliberate, and legal. When her lawyers filed the complaint, my own attorney had a field day. We countered not only with evidence of Karen's weekly harassment, video clips from neighbors' doorbell cameras, time-stamped photos of her SUV clipping my can, even her own social media posts bragging about cleaning up the neighborhood, but also with the findings of the HOA audit. The court didn't just see me as a wronged neighbor. They saw Karen for what she really was, a bully with a history of abuse and corruption. The lawsuit backfired spectacularly. Instead of putting me on the defensive, it opened the floodgates for further investigation. Prosecutors were already circling her finances thanks to the HOA audit, but now they had something even better, a pattern of intimidation, harassment, and reckless behavior. The crash into my trash can wasn't just property damage, it was evidence of her repeated misconduct. The neighborhood leaned into the spectacle. Every hearing was packed with residents eager to see the downfall of the woman who had terrorized them with fines and threats. They whispered, they snickered, and they recorded. For once, Karen was the one under the microscope. Every move dissected, every excuse shredded, and the cracks kept showing. Her Escalade repairs dragged on, bills piling higher and higher. Her once polished home started looking less pristine. Lawns untrimmed, shutters faded, mail piling up. For years, she had projected wealth and authority, but now, her empire was collapsing brick by brick. Then came the real blow. Investigators uncovered that her embezzlement wasn't just careless bookkeeping. It was deliberate fraud. Nearly $47,000 siphoned into accounts linked to her, funneled through fake vendors she herself had created. And when subpoenaed bank records confirmed the transactions, the case against her shifted from civil to criminal. Neighbors couldn't believe it. The woman who once fined a family $100 for having too many string lights on their porch during Christmas was now facing felony charges. The woman who lectured others about maintaining property values had single-handedly tanked the reputation of the entire HOA. Through it all, I stayed quiet, letting the legal process grind forward. I didn't need to gloat. Every headline, every whispered conversation in the neighborhood clubhouse, every glance at her battered Escalade was satisfaction enough. She had tried to make me a villain, but she had only cemented her own downfall. But Karen wasn't the type to surrender. Even as evidence mounted, even as her allies abandoned her, she kept lashing out. She sent letters to neighbors insisting she was the victim of a conspiracy. She accused the audit team of falsifying documents. She even claimed I had somehow hacked into HOA records to frame her. The desperation was obvious, but the noise kept coming. Her final G, ambit, was a motion to dismiss the case, filed under the claim that she was being targeted unfairly due to her position as HOA president. The judge didn't even entertain it. Instead, the judge issued a scathing statement, pointing out her blatant abuse of authority and her reckless endangerment of a neighbor's property. That ruling didn't just sink her motion. It set the tone for what came next. The civil case she had filed against me collapsed in flames. Not only was it dismissed with prejudice, but the judge ordered her to pay my legal fees. The total came to over $12,000, a sum she couldn't afford, not with criminal charges looming and her stolen funds already frozen. When the judgment was announced, the courtroom was silent for a moment, then filled with the quiet murmur of satisfaction from the neighbors who had come to watch. I walked out with my attorney, the weight of months of harassment finally lifting off my shoulders. Behind me, Karen sat slumped in her chair, face pale, eyes hollow. She had lost. But even then, even stripped of her power, her finances, and her reputation, she still wasn't done. That was the thing about Karen. She didn't know how to stop fighting, even when every battle only buried her deeper. And so, as the criminal case ramped up, as police began to comb through her records and prepare charges that could carry prison time, she made one last desperate attempt to salvage what little control she thought she had left. Because for Karen, losing wasn't just about money or power. It was about humiliation. And humiliation was something she couldn't accept. The civil court loss should have ended it. Any reasonable person would have taken the judgment, licked their wounds, and faded quietly into the background. But Karen Wellington was not reasonable. Losing her case, her money, and her position wasn't just a setback to her. It was a full-blown assault, icked on the identity she had spent years building. For as long as anyone could remember, Karen had defined herself by control. She was the neighbor who sent letters if your grass grew too long, the one who knocked on doors if your Christmas decorations stayed up past New Year's, the one who threatened fines over everything from basketball hoops to garden gnomes. Power wasn't a duty to her, it was a performance, a way of reminding everyone who she was and what she could do. Now, with her empire of fear crumbling, she was desperate to hold on to any scrap of authority. The first sign came in the form of glossy letters slipped into every mailbox in the neighborhood. They weren't official HOA communications anymore. Karen no longer had that power. Instead, they were personal manifestos, typed in all caps, sprinkled with bold words and underlined threats. She insisted she had been framed, that the audit was fraudulent, that the community was being poisoned by lies. She painted herself as a victim, someone who had sacrificed for the neighborhood only to be repaid with betrayal. Most people tossed the letters straight into the trash, but some, out of habit or fear, still read them. A few even felt a twinge of sympathy. After all, Karen had been a force in the neighborhood for years, and people don't shed old loyalties overnight. But those who still stood near her were standing on quicksand. The evidence was undeniable, and the city's prosecutors were already circling. Subpoenas had been issued, bank accounts had been frozen, a formal charge was imminent. The neighborhood itself transformed during this time. Without Karen patrolling the streets, people relaxed. Decorations blossomed in yards. Kids left bicycles in driveways without parents panicking over fines. Neighbors who had avoided each other out of fear of being reported began to gather again. Cookouts, evening walks, even small block parties. It was as if the community was collectively exhaling after years of holding its breath. But Ren couldn't stand watching that. She began inserting herself where she wasn't wanted. She would march down the sidewalk, scolding children, telling neighbors their hedges were too tall, shouting at people who parked on the street. Only now, instead of people cowering, they pushed back. Curtains were drawn. Doors were shut in her face. Conversations ended the moment she appeared. The power she once wielded with ease was gone, and all that was left was a bitter woman screaming into the void. Her desperation escalated into manipulation. She tried to recruit allies, whispering promises that when she was reinstated, because in her mind it wasn't if but when, she would reward those who stood by her. She went door to door, insisting the charges were fabricated, claiming she had proof, begging people to sign a petition declaring her innocence. But neighbors remembered the fines, the threats, the fear. And now, with the truth about her embezzlement exposed, the facade had cracked wide open. No one wanted to tie themselves to a sinking ship. When the indictment finally came, it was devastating. 3 felony charges: embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The dollar amount, $47,000, was plastered across local news headlines. For a woman who thrived on image, on respectability, on appearances, the public exposure was brutal. The morning after the story broke, her driveway became a stage. News vans rolled in. Cameras snapped photos of her tarp-covered Escalade, the once pristine symbol of her status, now a dented, rotting carcass. Karen herself emerged only briefly, storming to her mailbox in slippers and a robe, her face twisted in fury as reporters shouted questions. She slammed the door behind her, but the damage was done. Her downfall was now a spectacle, and the entire city was watching. For me, the irony was almost too much to process. All of this, all of it, had Stacy, Ted with a trash can. A simple act of pettiness spiraled into a chain of events that stripped her of everything she valued. She thought she was teaching me a lesson in compliance. Instead, she had exposed herself to the world as a fraud, a bully, and a criminal. The neighborhood celebrated quietly. There were no banners, no public statements, but the atmosphere was lighter, freer. People planted flowers, repainted fences, and shared stories they had once kept secret. They laughed about fines they had paid, rolled their eyes at memories of Karen's constant surveillance, and marveled at how quickly her power had evaporated. But beneath the relief, there was still tension. Karen hadn't given up. She was still writing letters, still filing complaints, still threatening massive lawsuits against anyone she deemed an enemy. And though she had fewer and fewer supporters, the noise she generated was exhausting. The community rallied in subtle ways. People checked in on each other. They shared legal advice, passed around updates on her case, and made sure no one felt isolated under her barrage of threats. For once, it felt like the HOA, stripped of Karen's iron grip, was actually serving its purpose, fostering community rather than controlling it. And then came the day of her arraignment. Dozens of neighbors attended, some out of curiosity, others out of a need for closure. The courtroom was silent as the charges were read. Karen stood stiffly, lips pressed tight, eyes darting around the room as if looking for allies who weren't there. When the judge asked for her plea, she declared herself not guilty, her voice trembling but defiant. It was a predictable move. Karen couldn't admit defeat. She couldn't admit fault. To her, the truth didn't matter. Only the story she told herself about being the victim of a grand conspiracy. But outside that courtroom, the truth was unavoidable. Her empire was gone. Her finances were in shambles. Her SUV was wrecked. Her neighbors had turned their backs. And yet, as he was escorted out past the crowd of reporters, I saw something in her expression that chilled me. Not shame, not regret, but determination. A flicker of stubborn fire that said she wasn't finished. Not yet. The criminal trial became the defining spectacle of Lakeside Estates. What had once been whispered gossip between neighbors was now a full-blown courtroom drama covered by local news outlets and dissected on social media. People who had never cared about HOA politics suddenly found themselves glued to updates, fascinated by the unraveling of a woman who had once ruled over her cul-de-sac like a monarch. Karen arrived at court every day in what could only be described as a performance. Some days she dressed in conservative suits, her hair pulled back tightly, as if to project authority. Other days, she appeared frail and tired, wrapped in shawls, clutching folders as though weighed down by imaginary burdens. But no matter what mask she wore, the cracks always showed. Her eyes darted nervously, her jaw clenched when testimony didn't go her way, and her hands trembled when evidence was displayed. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They showed the bank records, the fake vendor invoices, the checks signed by Karen herself. They mapped out the flow of nearly $47,000, siphoned away from community dues into accounts she controlled. They demonstrated how the projects she claimed had been completed: the sidewalk repairs, the landscaping upgrades, the security patrol contracts, had never existed. And when witnesses from the board took the stand, their stories matched perfectly. Karen had orchestrated it all. The defense, meanwhile, scrambled for footing. They leaned heavily on the narrative Karen had been pushing for months, that she was the victim of a vendetta. They suggested the audit was biased, that certain neighbors, my name was mentioned more than once, had conspired to ruin her reputation. They painted the reinforced trash can incident as evidence of a broader campaign of harassment against her. But no amount of finger-pointing could erase the numbers. Paper trails don't lie. And when the prosecution played a recording of a phone call Karen had made to one of her fake vendors, her voice unmistakable, discussing moving money around, the air in the courtroom grew heavy with inevitability. The neighborhood watched with rapt attention. Every day, people carpooled downtown to sit in the gallery. Some brought notebooks. Others simply wanted to be present, to see the woman who had fined them for mailboxes or lawn gnomes finally face accountability. It was more than a trial. It was catharsis. For me, it was strange. I hadn't wanted to become a central figure in this drama, but Karen's obsession with my trash can had put me in the spotlight whether I liked it or not. My name came up again and again in testimony, often as the first domino that tipped the whole chain of events. Some neighbors whispered thanks, saying I had been the one brave enough to stand against her. Others just laughed at the absurdity of it all, that a reinforced trash can had brought down a self-proclaimed queen. Karen, however, wasn't laughing. Each day she grew more desperate. She glared at me from across the courtroom, her eyes full of venom. She scribbled notes furiously, passing them to her attorney, who often shook his head as if to say no. She interrupted proceedings more than once, insisting she had evidence that was being ignored, only to be silenced by the judge. Her final gamble came during her own testimony. She took the stand with a steady posture, speaking confidently at first, insisting she had done nothing wrong. She claimed the accounts were for community reserves, that the missing funds were due to clerical errors, that any discrepancies were the result of overzealous accountants. But the longer she spoke, the shakier she became. Cross-examination, HR, added her excuses. Every denial was met with receipts, every claim contradicted by records. At one point, the prosecution asked her directly about the Escalade crash. They wanted to establish a pattern of reckless behavior. Karen, visibly rattled, tried to spin it as an innocent mistake. But when they presented video evidence, a neighbor's doorbell camera showing her veering deliberately into my trash can week after week, the jury's expressions hardened. It wasn't just theft. It was harassment, intimidation, abuse of power. The trial dragged on for weeks, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses consistent, the paper trail airtight. By the time closing arguments were made, the only suspense left was how harshly she would be punished. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was silent. Guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, abuse of fiduciary duty. The judge's voice was calm, almost clinical, but the weight of the words hit like a hammer. Karen's face crumpled, her carefully constructed image collapsing in real time. For the first time, she looked small, powerless, just another criminal caught in her own lies. The sentence wasn't immediate, but the consequences began at once. She was stripped of any remaining authority in the HOA. Fines were imposed. Restitution was ordered. And though the prison time was yet to be determined, the reality was clear. Karen's empire was gone. The neighborhood reacted with quiet celebration. There were no parades, no fireworks, but there were smiles exchanged on sidewalks, glasses raised at backyard barbecues, and a collective sense of relief that the storm had finally passed. For years, people had lived under her shadow. Now the sun was shining again. And yet for me, the strangest part was how it all felt. Not triumphant, not victorious, just finished. Karen had spent months trying to break me. But in the end, she had destroyed herself. All I had done was stand firm. Still, one chapter remained. Sentencing day loomed, and with it, the final word on the woman who had once thought she was untouchable. And as the date drew closer, the neighborhood braced itself for closure, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever been bullied, fined, or silenced by the Queen of Lakeside Estates. Sentencing day was the culmination of everything: the crash, the audit, the trial, the endless letters and accusations. For months, Karen had clung to the hope that somehow, some way, she could claw her way back into power, that she could rewrite the narrative and convince everyone she was the victim of a conspiracy. But by the time she walked into the courtroom that final morning, even she seemed to know it was over. She no longer wore tailored suits or crafted personas. Instead, she shuffled in with a pale, gaunt look, her once polished hair pulled back in haste. The woman who had once strutted through Lakeside Estates with her clipboard of violations now looked like someone stripped of all armor. And in a way, she was. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors filled every seat, some arriving hours early just to witness the conclusion. News crews hovered outside, cameras ready. Everyone wanted to see the end of the woman who had built her identity on intimidation, only to unravel under the weight of her own arrogance. The judge spoke clearly and firmly. Karen had been found guilty of embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The stolen $47,000 was not just numbers on a ledger. It was money taken directly from the community she claimed to protect. Her actions had eroded trust, destabilized the neighborhood, and turned what should have been a place of safety into a stage for her power plays. The sentence was a mixture of restitution, fines, and probation. Prison time was suspended due to her lack of prior record, but the financial burden was crushing. She was ordered to repay the $47,000, along with additional penalties and court costs. And then came the part that made the room shift, the civil judgment from my case. The judge reaffirmed that Karen's harassment had gone beyond neighborly disputes. Her lawsuit against me had been malicious, and her actions reckless. She was ordered to pay me $12,000 in damages and legal fees. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Then, scattered murmurs spread among the neighbors, a few smiles, a few quiet nods. It wasn't about the money, it was about the symbolism. The woman who had spent years fining others now had to pay. The enforcer of rules had finally faced consequences. Karen's reaction was predictable. She tried to argue. She begged for leniency. She claimed she didn't have the funds, that repayment was impossible, that she was being punished unfairly. But the judge cut through it all with a single statement. This court does not tolerate abuse of power. You are not the victim here. And just like that, the gavel came down. It was finished. The days that followed were a quiet celebration across Lakeside Estates. People decorated their yards without fear of letters appearing in their mailboxes. Kids left basketball hoops out overnight without threats of fines. Neighbors waved to each other, free of the tension that had hung over them for years. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was freedom. For me, the $12,000 settlement wasn't life-changing money, but it was vindication. It was proof that standing up, even against someone who seemed untouchable, could matter. I deposited the check with a kind of satisfaction that no amount of gloating could equal. My trash can, still reinforced and unmovable, stood at the curb like a quiet monument to the whole ordeal. Neighbors laughed about it now, calling it the can that ended a queen. As for Karen, her decline was swift and merciless. She sold the Escalade for scrap, unable to afford repairs. Her home went on the market not long after, the once pristine, lawn overgrown, paint peeling from the shutters. Rumor spread that she was moving in with a relative, forced out not by official decree, but by the simple reality that she could no longer afford to stay. The day the moving truck arrived, neighbors peeked from windows but didn't come out to wave. Some felt pity. Others felt satisfaction. Most just felt relief. She loaded boxes in silence, no friends or allies there to help. The empire she had built on fear had collapsed, leaving only isolation. Weeks later, a new family moved into her old house. They were welcomed warmly, invited to block parties, given plates of cookies by neighbors eager to start fresh. The shadow of Karen Wellington had lifted, and the neighborhood flourished in its absence. Looking back, it's almost surreal to think about how it all started. One trash can, one petty act repeated week after week, meant to bully me into compliance. She thought she was showing me my place. She thought she was proving her power. Instead, she drove headfirst into her own downfall. The reinforced trash can didn't just stop her SUV. It stopped years of intimidation, lies, and abuse. It exposed the fraud she had hidden, dismantled her control, and restored balance to a neighborhood she had ruled like a tyrant. For me, it was never about revenge. It was about standing firm, refusing to be pushed over the way she had pushed over that can 57 times. And in the end, it was Karen herself who toppled. Not the trash can, not me, but her own greed and arrogance. Now, every trash day, I wheel my can to the curb with a small smile. It doesn't move. It doesn't bend. It doesn't fall. It stands as a reminder, to me, to the neighbors, maybe even to Karen wherever she ended up, that no one is untouchable. No one is above the rules. And sometimes, the smallest stand can make the biggest difference. The queen of Lakeside Estates was gone. The neighborhood was free. And all it took was a trash can she never saw coming.